Hi everybody. We're so thrilled to be back at the Capitol Theater for opera once again, albeit opera in a different version. I'm Carol Anderson, the principal coach of the Utah Opera, and I am so happy to welcome you to my virtual prelude lecture. Normally we'd be gathering with 50 or 75 friends in the Capitol room. That's just not happening right now, so thank you for taking the time to watch on our website. I also want to give a big shout out to Kathleen Sykes, our digital content producer, who is behind the camera right now helping me with this presentation. So thank you, Kathleen. And I just waved at her. So to recap just a little bit, we should have been doing Richard Wagner's Flying Dutchman about this time. But we live in a very different world than last fall when we were planning our 2021 season, when we were finalizing all of those details. Just in case you've been living under a rock, singers are some of the biggest super spreaders of our coronavirus in aerosolized forms, so putting 50 of them on stage in a big clump was not an option, let alone putting a large orchestra in our orchestra pit, which is of course an enclosed space. Like so many of our fellow performing arts organizations, Utah Opera had to make a very swift pivot this summer. Normally we spend 1 or 2 years planning an opera production, and we planned this one in about 8 weeks. And of course, all of our colleagues are doing that across the country. Tonight's offerings were chosen because artistically, they both deal with themes of isolation, and I think we've all dealt with that in our own ways in these last few months. There are also logistical reasons, though. Each work is a short duration. One is 40 minutes and one is about 25, and has a tiny cast. So that works well with the precautions we need to take on stage for the safety of our performers and for our audience members, you. We've had to consider things we never thought of as we planned for this rehearsal process and for the performance weeks. Our company mission of bringing great live music to our community has expanded to add with foremost concern for the safety of our performers, our crew and cast, and of course our audience. During rehearsals at the production studios, we set aside a large rehearsal room for each opera separately so that the two casts didn't mix. And we could also then keep props separate and sanitized. We have 2 casts for each of the operas, so each cast is using their own props as well, so there's no mingling. We even had a question about a hat, and each cast member in Gentleman's Island has their own hat. Even though we can sanitize, we have ultraviolet machinery at the production studios, but this was the choice for our cast to make it the most safe. Each rehearsal room is fully stocked with disinfectant, hand sanitizer, and we leave the room after 90 minutes to let our HVAC system at the production studios refresh the air. During the rehearsals, the conductor, the pianist, the stage management, and the director all have plexiglass shields in front of them, so they're separated from the singers. And for the most part, the singers have been masked at all times. This is a really new thing for singers to sing masked. If you think about it, you've all had to be masked, and you know how muffled it is. Imagine what that feels like as a singer whose mouth is such an integral part of their lives. It's been an adjustment for them in particular. This is particularly tricky in Gentleman's Island, where there's about a 3-minute song and dance number. The gentlemen of the Gentleman's Island are just sucking wind at the end of that, and it's even harder to do it when you're singing, dancing, and wearing a mask. Some of our artists came from New York, where the lockdown was much more severe, and they've been very gratified to see the seriousness with which we took our planning, and everyone has been very respectful of the process. Here in the theater, we will be cordoning off the orchestra from the cast. So the cast will have their areas backstage, downstairs, and that's only for cast and the people who are part of making the opera happen for them. The orchestra will be in the Capitol room right behind me, and will only be allowed to come in through the Capitol room doors and then go straight to the stage. So we won't have that normal mingling. It's very strange because we're used to just chit-chatting backstage with whomever, and we were having to adjust that sort of part of the show experience for us. And of course, you're having to adjust by not being able to mingle in the lobby. So tonight's double bill is 2 short operas with tiny casts. One is a cast of 1 and one is a cast of 2. By a happy coincidence, we ended up choosing 2 pieces that were both written in 1958. I don't think it was intended at all, but it just happened that way. Both pieces deal with isolation, and it's interesting that in 1958, the world was actually a pretty happy place, relatively speaking. There were, of course, your various things going on with, the Cold War and and stuff like that, but they were the happy days of that TV show, relatively speaking. Francis Poulenc is the composer of our first part of the double bill. He is a favorite composer of mine. He was born in 1899 and he died in 1963. I hope I got that right. I've always thought that my affinity for his works was because our birthdays are only a day apart. We're both Capricorns. I mean, a day and many years apart, but we are both Capricorns. I'm born January 6th and he's January 7th. I actually did a whole project with Poulenc in my studying of my master's degree, so I had a lot of experience with his music and really enjoyed getting to learn the human voice. Poulenc was part of a group of French composers known as Les Six, which literally means the six. French critic Henri Collet coined that name as a kind of response to a Russian group of five who were called the Mighty Five. So we had the Mighty Five in Russian and Les Six, just one extra one in France. Nothing really links them compositionally or stylistically. They just all happen to be working in Paris at the same time. And according to Darius Milhaud, who was one of Les Six, Collet chose 6 names arbitrarily, those of Georges Auric, Duret, Arthur Honegger, Poulenc, and Germaine Taillefer, and Milhaud, simply because we knew each other and we were pals and appeared on the same musical programs, no matter if our temperaments and personalities weren't at all the same. Auric and Poulenc followed ideas of Cocteau, Jean Cocteau. Honegger followed German Romanticism, and myself, Milhaud, Mediterranean lyricism. So that's from one of Les Six. The group collaborated as a whole only one time in 1920 on an album of 6, not a written album, not a recorded album, of 6 piano pieces, but various combinations of them worked on projects all the way through the 50s. So Jean Cocteau was a playwright, director, script writer, and he was often known for some of his surrealistic works. One of the things I saw early on was his version of Beauty and the Beast, which is a beautiful silent film. I actually saw it in a production with a new score written by Philip Glass. So it was a really extraordinary visual work, and then we added to that this amazing music. So he wrote the monodrama La Voix Humaine, or The Human Voice, in 1928, and it was first staged at the Comédie Française in 1930. In some accounts, it said that Cocteau created the monodrama in response to some of the actors he worked with who said that his work was too director-oriented. So this was a chance for an actress to have a real tour de force performance. During this piece, a woman is speaking on the phone to her ex-lover, processing through the ending of their 5-year relationship. He's about to actually marry another woman. The voice of the lover is never heard. There have been several works inspired by or based on this play other than Poulenc's version. Menotti wrote a comic opera called The Telephone, and there are several film versions. There's an Italian one starring Sophia Loren, directed by her then husband Carlo Ponti. I think that's correct, that Carlo Ponti did it. There's a version with Ingrid Bergman that was from a 1960s NBC anthology series. That was a fun rabbit hole to go down because there's a lot of really interesting content that was created for that series. And then there's a 2020 version starring Tilda Swinton, directed by the Spanish director Pedro Almodovar. The opera is going to be sung in English tonight. Poulenc never spoke about the vernacular specifically for this piece. However, for Dialogues of the Carmelites, which is his masterpiece, he specifically asked that it be performed in the vernacular language of the producing country. So we are kind of following a precedent by doing it in English here. Kristine McIntyre, who created our wonderful production of Moby Dick several years ago, created the English adaptation and has updated the setting to include some modern communication devices. So you'll see iPads and iPhones on there. We should have gotten an Apple sponsorship, but we didn't manage that. I should mention, we also had to source some modern furniture for the set. And so my own personal IKEA nightstand, sorry, Kathleen, I just hit the microphone, is on the set. So That's my contribution to the production besides the piano playing and things like that. Poulenc's music for the opera is a combination of recitative or arioso, we sometimes call it, sung speech, alternating with more lyrical melodic moments. Musicologist Keith Daniel, in his survey of Poulenc's works, says that 186 of the 780 measures of the piece are actually unaccompanied, which is really quite fascinating. And of course, only a musicologist would count all those measures, right? So let's look at some musical examples, and I will demonstrate for you on the piano. So the opening of La Voix Humaine is pretty angular, and I think it's just meant to kind of show you how I guess, skewed her thought processes as she's working through this grief of losing this relationship. As the conversation progresses, we've all been there. The conversation can change on a dime. You might be talking on the phone and then suddenly you hear somebody mowing the lawn. You're like, oh my gosh, I can't hear over the lawnmower. Similar things happen during this. So she's just said, Elle is who, she doesn't have a name, she's just called Elle, which is the French word for her, or for she. She's in the middle of saying, I could hear your voice with these beautiful chords, exactly like I do tonight on the phone. And we're in this suspended moment, and then suddenly we get Poulenc's style is quite eclectic. He gathers from the jazz trends of his early days, the 20s and the 30s. So we'll hear moments that are chords that are quite a bit jazzy. We've already seen that there's some moments of dissonance meant to show emotional turmoil. He also uses cells of musical material repeated at different pitch levels. And these cells, usually just a bar, a measure of music, have a sort of mood all of themselves. For instance, the one I'm going to demonstrate with has these offbeat pizzicatos which kind of show agitation, and then he switches very quickly to something that's quite a bit more lyrical. I'll even sing a little bit. Back then, we would go out, we would do things that were crazy, forget our obligations. Whatever we wanted, we tell ourselves that love's enough. Wrap me in your arms, make it all go away. And one look would change my whole world. So the repetition and growth of the cell kind of created this idea of agitation, and then we spread it out into this moment of, and then everything would change. And one look for you was enough to change everything about my life. And then, of course, I promised you moments of great lyrical beauty. We have a ways to go in the piece before we get to one of those melodies, but when they do happen, they are quite sublime. So this is a moment where she's talking about trying to assure her lover that she's fine. I mean, she's made some poor choices as she's processed this breakup. But later on, right after this, she says, forgive me, love. I know that this whole thing is just so unbearable and that you're being very patient with me. Please understand I'm suffering. And this line, this telephone line, is the last thing I have. So she's a little bit needy at this moment, but we have this beautiful lyrical melody. So now, without an intermission, of course, because we want to minimize mingling in the lobby, we will move to a lighter treatment of isolation with Joseph Horovitz's Gentleman's Island. Do you know this piece? I don't know this piece either. I do now. But none of us knew it before except for Christopher Macbeth. Christopher Macbeth actually performed this piece in the role of Summers, the indigo importer, in his college days at Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa. He, of course, you may or may not know this, had a previous incarnation as an operatic bass. So he brought this out, and it's really perfect for social distancing because you have two characters who can remain distanced. In fact, that's one of the premises of the plot. Joseph Horovitz was born in Vienna in 1926, and his family emigrated to London in 1938 to escape, as so many musicians did, the fascist Nazi regime that was taking power in the continent of Europe. But he's definitely a product of British education. He studied at Oxford, and he also studied at the Royal College of Music. As did many of his composers of his generation, he also spent a year in Paris under the tutelage of the famed pedagogue Nadia Boulanger. She was one of the great composition teachers of the early and mid 20th century. Aaron Copland studied with her. Kind of anyone who was anyone in the 40s, 50s, 60s studied with Nadia Boulanger at some point. His most often performed work, I discovered, is Captain Noah and His Floating Zoo, which is a lighthearted oratorio treatment of the Noah story that's obviously intended for younger audiences. This one's tonight is a little bit more sophisticated. So the source material for the piece is really interesting. In the 1860s, W.S. Gilbert, who was later part of the duo that we all know as Gilbert and Sullivan, wrote a number of comic ballads that he signed with his childhood nickname, Bab. 40 of them were eventually collected and published with comic illustrations, and Gentleman's Island is based on one of those poems. If you'll download the virtual program book, we've included the text of the original poem in there along with an illustration. So please do take advantage of that through, let me plug the USUO app that you'll want to download before you come to the theater. So the plot is a Victorian plot. Two gentlemen have been shipwrecked on a desert island, probably in the South Pacific, because they mentioned at one point Australia and such. They have taken up residence at opposite ends of the island because they have never been introduced. This is a very Victorian convention. If you were not properly introduced by a mutual acquaintance, you were not allowed to interact socially. And apparently these two gentlemen were so caught up in the Victorian mores of the day that even on a desert island, they weren't going to break this. Can you imagine that in Survivor if no one interacted? What a boring show. So they do, however, discover a mutual acquaintance, and they decide that that's just enough to merit a connection. And this is very advantageous to each of them because they each have dietary restrictions that can only be met by food sources that are on the other person's part of the island. So it works out great. However, quickly, after a certain amount of time passes, and then when they discover that the mutual acquaintance, their friend Robinson, is actually has a scandalous story, and they can no longer be connected through him because of this scandal. And so they disconnect, and they realize they're just going to die alone on this desert island. Strange, huh? But as much as it ends with their supposed death, it's very lighthearted and fun. And Horovitz's music is quite light and quite tuneful, and actually in many cases has a real musical theater dance vibe to it. So let's look at some examples from Gentleman's Island. So as I said, Gentleman's Island probably is in the South Pacific somewhere that we don't know for sure, but we talk about a coral reef off the coast of Caribou. I'm not sure, I haven't done research to see if Caribou is an actual real place. And of course there's a reference later on to Botany Bay, which was the name for the penal colony of Australia. So that's the implication of that we're on a coral island in the South Seas somewhere. And we have island music to begin. It's like piano figurations, and it's just very, it's like the breezes of the island. So it sets up as kind of a fun place, a lovely place. Then we go to the first, there's a first musical change, and this is where the gentlemen are singing of their situation. And the monotony of living on the island is exemplified through this monotonous music that happens. So that is kind of like a plodding march, the march of time that is just kind of happening throughout on this island. So once the two gentlemen have identified that they have this mutual acquaintance, Robinson, they of course go to town, they share their food sources. One of them enjoys the oysters from the other part of the island and the other wants to make turtle soup out of the turtles. And then they get to talking about Robinson and their friend Robinson. So one of them went to boarding school with Robinson and the other one was with him at Oxford. Part of being at Oxford is the idea of rowing crew. People would row down the Thames River, and it's always a big, if you see a film that's set in Oxford, usually there's going to be an establishing shot of the Thames and somebody, an 8-man boat or scull going down the river. And the part of the river that goes through Oxford is called the Isis. It's sort of an Oxford thing. So they're talking about the fact that he rowed crew at Isis, their friend Robinson. There's almost a British anthem at this moment. It's just very martial, and that's like Go Britain, and it's that sort of nationalistic Britain thing. And we hear that all the way through. Great Britain, not Benjamin Britten. So once these two gentlemen realize that they're going to have to end their acquaintance because it's just been created through, scandalous connections, they have to separate back to their parts of the island. Of course, because of social distancing and the staging, they never actually are touching or near each other. We're always at least 6 to 10 feet apart. But the music goes back to exactly what we had at the beginning, very similar, and not exactly, with this kind of arpeggios. And that's meant to show that, look, we had this moment of connection, but then nothing changed. We're back to our normal life. Doesn't end sad. Ends a little hopeful. Maybe they'll connect again. I don't know, but for now, separated. Tonight's conductor has been with us at the Utah Opera a number of times, most recently with The Little Prince that was such a success in 2019. He's also a talented orchestrator, and so we asked him for a special contribution to tonight's performance. With the permission of Joseph Horovitz's publishers, we were able to ask Jim to rescore the piece for what I'm calling wittily pandemic ensemble, which basically means anybody who can wear a mask while they play. So that cuts out our winds and brass. So basically he took Horovitz's orchestration of many of the instruments that we're using and then filled out things with 2 pianos and celestas. So he also did some fun percussion additions to kind of give it this island vibe. So if you haven't already, I would encourage you to download the USCO app. Also on our website, we have a wonderful safety video that Kathleen produced with featuring some of our opera and symphony artists, and they will help you walk you through the procedures of what to expect when you come to the Capitol Theater. We'll have volunteers to greet you, and it's may sound intimidating, but I went to the Symphony last week and it was just a painless, I just zoomed right into my seat, so it was great. And we've producing some video content for you to watch while you wait for the opera to start. So we're looking forward to sharing that with you as well. We appreciate your support so very much, not just financially. People have been incredibly generous in these last 6 months, but also just the fact that you are willing to come back downtown and help make this opera a success here at the Janet Quinney Lawson Capitol Theater. We have missed this place so desperately, and we are thrilled to be back. We're proud to be one of the few opera companies in the country that is performing live, and we just say welcome back to Utah Opera and stay safe.